Ja, just det. Precis. Det är bra. Men båda kan vara på samtidigt. Ja.
Så jag sätter på båda.
Jättebra. Och Gunnar, du lämnar över till mig.
Har vi presenter i panelen sen?
Ja.
En tv-licens.
Livstids tv-licens. Är alla här som ska vara här?
Ja. Matt kom här så att...
Ja, jag såg honom här.
Ja.
Vad bra.
Good morning. Hi, how you doing? Okay.
Morning.
Yeah. Your presentation is there.
Yeah.
You can use, if you want this one, you can use that one.
So how do I read these?
Med myggmikrofoner, då behövs inte mygg.
Okej.
Nej, alltså jag vet inte. Would you like a headset or...
This is fine, yeah, if that's all right.
Vi kanske kan använda det. Det kanske bara jag som vill ha headset.
Men jag tänkte på lös mick för publikfrågor.
Ja, men det ska vi absolut. Ja, det finns två stycken.
Det är bra om vi får lite interaktion.
Absolut. Det är alltid så. Det är alltid några...
Right.
Det skulle ju ha någon som sitter här som har mikrofonen som kan springa ut.
Ja.
Och en som sitter på den sidan.
Ja, det vore det bästa.
Nu ligger Centerpartiet på 4.
It's great. I think I've left my passport in my room, so I'm just going to run back and get it. It'll be 2 seconds.
Okej.
Yeah.
Mycket jobbigt.
Ja, det tycker jag var
Ja. Tar du upp min presentation då?
Ja.
Magnus?
Undrar vad som händer nu då om han...
Ja, det kan vi göra. Vi säger in när om du går det. Ja, du får.
Det blir lätt att dra ner mickarna en tappning till mig. Ja, det är ju också. Men jag fyller ut dem och de där. Ja, för att om de står där fast de har ut dem på sidan. Så att vi tar upp frågor när de behövs, om man säger så. Ja, det vore toppen.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second hearing of the Public Service Commission. My name is Gunnar Strömblad, and I'm the chairman of the Commission. Welcome also you who are watching us on the web, because this whole conference is being broadcasted over internet. Just a few words about the Commission. This is initiators, the ones that are paying for us. Bonnier, MTG, Schibsted Sweden, Mittmedia, Bauer Media Group, and TU, the Swedish Media Publishers Association. So all those represent, I'd say, 80 to 90% of the private media business in Sweden. So it's a massive backing that we have in our job. There is some funny thing on the screen there. What to do about that?
Your desktop agent sounds dangerous.
I'll see if I can do something about it. So this is the Commission, except for myself, then it's Agneta Dreber, Hans-Gunnar Axberger, Mikaela Waltersson, and Pelle Snickars. It's a distinguished group. We even have two professors on the group, and I'm not one of them. And then I can't change the slide. All those technical things. Interesting. Magnus, can you help me? The slides doesn't change. I love this. Magnus, are you here? I love this. Okay. We forget about those pictures then. I'm not used to this computer, so. No, okay. So, we're on track again. The purpose of the Commission, very briefly, is to bring up the issue of public service to more debate. There is not so much debate in Sweden about public service. I think it's, as we will find out this morning, it's a lot more debate in, for example, the UK, Norway, and so on. And it's kind of a little bit like it's forbidden to discuss public service in Sweden. It's a bit of a sensitive issue, and we want to change that. We want to illustrate how public service affects the other media companies in Sweden, especially in light of what's happening in the media market right now. It's quite obvious. And investigate if there are any issues with the current definition, function, and so on regarding public service. I mean, it's been the same rules and regulations, basically, and definition since the early days of public service, and it's a completely different media market today. So maybe it's time to discuss, is it going to be exactly the same for the next 100 years as it's been for the last 100 years? And also we plan to make some recommendations then for the future. And the purpose of today's hearing, that is, of course, to get a better understanding of what's happening in the northern part of Europe, most of Scandinavia, Netherlands, UK, and so on. So I think when we leave today for lunch, we will have a much better understanding of the debate and what's going on around public service all over at least the northern part of Europe. And I'm really looking forward to this. If you want to be on Twitter, it's hashtag PSKOM. That's the hashtag. So then it's time to introduce our host today. He's a radio legend.
Wow.
If you are Swedish, you will recognize his voice. Willy Silfverstrand.
Thank you very much.
Yours.
Before you sit down, I have one question. If people say this is sort of you're trying to fight public service, what do you say to those?
We get this question all the time, and a lot of the criticism is that we have already decided upon the conclusions and so on. And it's simply not true. We all think that public service plays a very important role in the Swedish media sector, no doubt about that. But you can say we love public service, we love our children as well, but that doesn't mean that we can't tell them what to do and what not to do.
Okay, good.
That's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I am the moderator today. My name is Willy Silberstein. I worked many years with public service with Swedish radio. And before I introduce the first speaker, I would just like to invite all of you, if you have questions after the speakers or when we will have panels up here, just give me a hand. It is vital that you have a microphone in your hand before you ask your question, because this is being broadcasted on internet, and without a microphone, it simply won't work. Having said that, I'm very happy to welcome Karen Donders, professor from Brussels, the Vrije Universiteit. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. Welcome up.
Can anyone put a presentation? Okay. Yes, there it is. Good morning, everyone. I have to say I was a little bit surprised to see so many people turn up for an event on public service broadcasting and its future. I don't think in Belgium the audience would be so, well, with so many people and hopefully also enthusiastic about the topic. For today, I prepared a presentation basically providing a bird's eye perspective on what is happening in Western and Northern Europe in terms of public service media regulation. I'm by far an expert in Scandinavian public broadcasting regimes. There are plenty of people in the program that know everything about public broadcasting in Sweden, Norway, Denmark. I'm not one of those people. I mainly focus on European level policies and on public broadcasting policies in countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, United Kingdom and Ireland. I will fly through the background slides because I kind of assume that you're all quite familiar with it, and I understand you also had a first hearing and perhaps some of these contextual factors did came up. Firstly, obviously, you know, we are evolving from public broadcasting to public service media. There's actually something in academia that has been covered already in the 1990s. But in this case, and that's fairly exceptional, the academics moved a bit quicker than the rest of the world, in the sense that you see at a policy level, but also with public broadcasters themselves, it's quite difficult to make this shift from a mass public broadcaster, a one-to-many model, to a many-to-many model, a technology-neutral model. That's the first thing. The second thing is that everywhere I go, whether it's in policy or academic conferences, people are always telling me, and I think it relates a bit to the first question that Willy asked, that there is increased pressure from the private sector on public service media. About the scope of what public broadcasters are doing, also about its financing, certainly in dually funded systems, like the Netherlands, Belgium, where you have also advertising, online advertising, very hot topics, whether public broadcasters should be doing this. Now, I would like to nuance this idea of increased pressure a bit, because that's always like a trick history tries to play with our minds, is that we always think here and now that has never been like this and that never been this worse. What you actually see is that tensions between public and private sector comes in waves. You can kind of document this very well if you look at the past 30 years of public broadcasting policy. And I don't think I need to explain you that obviously private sector has major issues in terms of valorizing content in a digital age. And in that sense, it's not so surprising that there is kind of a rising question of public broadcasting and what it should do in this very, very difficult environment. Third contextual factor, something I think we cannot deny, is definitely increased intervention from European Commission that is looking at the funding of public service broadcasting since the beginning of the 1990s and is treating this as an exception to the internal market, which is a bit strange to us because in Western and Northern Europe we have this idea of public broadcasting being a basic element of the system and not so much an exception. Funding to public broadcaster has to comply with three things. The remit has to be defined in a very, very clear way. You have to entrust the remit with an official act, a management contract, media law, something like that. And you cannot give more money than what is stricto sensu necessary to fulfill the public task, which obviously is a bit of a tricky one. And what you see as a consequence of European Commission intervention is some basic level of harmonization, very superficial, of European public broadcasting policies. The public value test, and I will come back to that later, is a very good example of that. And then fourthly, what you also see in a lot of member states, and I think to some extent this commission is kind of an exponent of that, is a louder question to show what is the distinctiveness of public service media in a digital age, where you do not only have competition from commercial broadcasters, but also from print, from players like YouTube, Netflix. So what is it that makes public broadcasting special in this age of supposed, but not real, abundance? So very, very quickly, that was background, but I'm sure you all know this, but it's basically to start on the same page. What the Commission basically asked me to do is focus on what are a bit, let's say, the generic policy approaches in Europe. So how do governments deal with these four challenges? And then to zoom in a bit deeper on specific policy instruments. So when we look at traditional regulatory approaches, and it's not only me saying this, you have three different approaches. This obviously is generalizing to an extent that is not recognizing the uniqueness of each public broadcasting system. But you have what we call the enabling approach, you have the disabling, and then something in between. The enabling approach will sound very familiar, I hope, is high editorial independence, relatively few in comparison with others, regulatory requirements, like really short management contracts of 15, 20, 25 pages, things like that. New media, like 10 years ago, not considered a problem from the outset, and often this enabling model is associated with Scandinavian countries like Sweden. You can decide on that later, whether that is indeed the case, but if I hear the president of the Commission saying that it sometimes seems a bit forbidden to discuss about the role of public service broadcasting, then this might be a good reflection of reality. Then you have the disabling models, bit the opposite story, low levels of editorial independence, not that much regulation either, but really day-to-day political interference with public service broadcasting. Lots of heated conflicts with private media companies. And when I mean conflict, like not the civil and polite kind of conflict, but really very politicized kind of conflict between public and private companies, often associated with Southern Europe and increasingly so, regrettably so, with Eastern European public broadcasting regimes. And then traditionally you have the in-between. That's something we're very fond of in Europe. High editorial independence, but also quite extensive regulation. Management contracts of 70, 80, 90 pages. So lots of specifications on what public broadcasters should do. New media 10 years ago allowed, but already at that point, some tension and some restrictions at the same time. Conflict, but the conflict is like stable, it's part of the game, so to speak. And where you often see this is in countries like Belgium, Germany, Ireland, United Kingdom. What we see today is a modification of these traditional regulatory approaches. The in-between model is a bit changing in the sense that new media is not only allowed, it's actually specified to be really a core task of public broadcasters, so it's something that becomes enforceable. But at the same time, to meet private sector concerns, you already have some like emerging regulation. Also in the in-between model, you see a lot of attention, increasingly so, for collaboration between public broadcasters and private media companies. I'll come back to that later. A bit of a worrying trend is that next to the traditional disabling model, the Southern and Eastern European countries, there is the emergence of like a new disabling model, where you see a lot of micromanagement rules and a lot of restrictions on new media and online behavior. I'll come back to that later as well. When we then look at Europe, many scholars are saying that some Scandinavian countries seem to be making the move to the middle of this picture, so to the in-between scenario, whereas you see that countries such as Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and also the Netherlands are moving to this disabling model, with limits on the number of words, no blogs, no forums, no chat rooms, no price comparison websites, stuff like that. And also in the Netherlands with limitations on sports and entertainment. Other countries like, well, Flanders is not a country, but we behave like it is one. Regions like Flanders and countries like UK and Ireland are remaining in the in-between perspective. And here you do see some very interesting collaboration initiatives between public and private broadcasters. And we can come back to that later, perhaps in the question section. Now, when you then look at specific policy instruments, I basically singled out two, because there are so much. But what you see in a lot of countries, I basically focused on, is the public value test. Public value test, as you all know, originated in the UK, consists of two elements: public value assessment, BBC Trust, market impact assessment done by Ofcom, and then the trust is basically balancing the two and accepting whether a newly proposed service is okay to deliver by the BBC or not. If you look at this map, the red countries are basically the countries that have a test, legally speaking. This is very, very important, because it's not because you have a test in law that it's actually being executed. There's several countries that have a test and have never, ever, ever used it. For example, my country/region, Flanders, has a test already for 6 years and has never ever done a test. And kind of the consensus between the public broadcaster and the government is to avoid using it when possible, but just to have it in law to please the European Commission. The blue countries, by the way, for those wondering, are those about to implement an ex-ante procedure. So that's Poland and Czechia. There is a huge variety across Europe in terms of the tests. So the European Commission is asking it. But then if you see how it's, because I was a lover of the test when it first originated, like in 2006-07, I thought this is really a good idea. In theory, if you see what people are doing with it in practice, it's just, we have to get rid of it because it's really, scandalous, I would say. You see a huge variety in terms of who is responsible. In the Netherlands, the minister. I think that's a very, very bad idea to let governments decide on this. In Germany, there are internal bodies. In some countries, you have media regulators and competition authorities. Competition authorities not involved that much, which is a bit surprising. And in some countries, the test is also not binding. So then you have an entirely independent, research-based procedure, and then it's saying yes or no. And then the government is overruling it, which is a bit also strange. Then you can better not have a test, I think. There's also a huge difference in terms of length of the test stages, involvement of third parties. Like in the Netherlands, they really have the worst test ever. It's broadcast. Well, anyway, you can show it. I really am convinced it's the worst test ever, because their private media companies can only give their comments once the minister already took a draft decision, which is a bit strange, because politicians are not really keen on returning on decisions, even if they're draft decisions. So that's really kind of a discrimination of the private sector that also went to court. The court said, yes, you're right. Then they went to a higher court. Then this court said, no, the government is right. And now it's back with the European Commission. So it's a never-ending story, basically. But you might see, I'm not really fond of these public value tests as they are being implemented in most countries, because they're very expensive. And basically, according to me, it's a big window dressing exercise. Because I think overall in Europe you had over 70 tests. Germany, obviously, the record holder with over 40 tests. What you see is people getting tired of it, costing a lot of money, and basically, with few exceptions, all services are being approved. In terms of effectivity of regulation, that's a bit limited. Second example, which is becoming a bit standard in a lot of European countries, is to introduce limits on new media services. That's kind of the new fashion. So we have countries where they basically prohibit certain services, like Germany, Wallonia, really have these extensive lists of services you cannot do. Some countries do not opt for such a list because they say it would go against press freedom. Something to say for it, something to say against that. You have countries where they limit the number of words of text articles. So if people counting, whether it's 900 words or a bit more, which is the case in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. In some countries, like Flanders and the Netherlands, they're basically saying no emphasis on text. The emphasis has to be on the audiovisual. But how do you operationalize that? It's nice that you put it in there, but it really does not really have a specific meaning. And then you have some countries with no specifications on text and press-like services at all. Also fashionable is limiting the duration of offering online video. like 24 hours for sports videos, 7 days for drama, like 3 months for culture because nobody else is doing that, so nobody else minds, and stuff like that. I think that's also a bit pointless because you kind of tend to agree with rights holders about how long you can offer video online. So lots of countries have this, UK, Germany, Wallonia also, Flanders not, so you see that within Belgium there is a lot of differences, and also in Europe, which makes legal predictability for private companies actually very, very limited, and also the effectivity of all these rules, and sometimes really, really details, in terms of limiting market distortion, I would say is very questionable. So far, I haven't seen any research, and you do have quite some research on market impact that shows that these measures have earned the private sector €1 more. So I think it's basically a waste of time, and governments should, I will skip what would I do, what should public broadcasters do? I'll go directly to what should governments do. Well, I think the first is self-evident. I think when regulating public broadcasting, you should be quite specific on how you want to make sure that public broadcasters serve audiences and society. When it comes to protecting private media companies, and I don't think this is not an important policy goal, I do not believe anymore, having seen all the empirical evidence, that all this micromanagement, these limits, the public value test, that is doing anything good. It's not limiting market distortion, and it's basically taking attention away from the fundamental issue, and that it's really not public broadcasters fighting private broadcasters or local press companies. It's really about international conglomerates walking away with lots of the local revenues, and that's really a big issue. And I think governments should rather focus on facilitating, enhancing collaboration between private players and public broadcasters. Public broadcasters can really be a tool, and in some countries you see very successful examples of sharing content, sharing video, of doing technological innovation projects together, and even developing commercial business models together. And I think instead of focusing on rules that prove to be ineffective, one should rather focus on taking initiatives and facilitating initiatives that will actually do something that companies and media users will benefit from. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you. You will be back. Oh, if you don't break a leg, you will be back for a panel discussion. Thank you so much. The next speaker is Matt Rogerson. He is head of public policy at the Guardian Media Group in Great Britain. Matt, his first visit to Sweden, so welcome him with a big applause.
Good morning. As Willie said, I work for Guardian Media Group, which is, we are the parent group of the Guardian newspaper, which many of you may read. Before that I worked for a telecoms company, and before that I worked in Parliament, and throughout that time the BBC and charter reviews played quite a big part in my life. It's quite good to come to a country where you don't debate public service broadcasting very much, because in Britain that's all we talk about. This morning I had a media alert with 6 stories about the BBC and how much money they waste, all of which are pretty repetitive about every single day. So I'm just going to go through a bit of context and then an overview of what's happening in the UK in terms of the process, and pick up on some of the points that were made just a moment ago. So obviously charter review takes place every 10 years in the UK, and every 10 years people will say that the media environment is changing a lot. So I'll say the media environment is changing a lot. But a couple of really interesting points to pick up on. I think for the BBC, one of their biggest issues is maintaining faith and trust in the licence fee, and a desire on the part of the UK public to pay for the licence fee. And I think that's becoming even harder in the changing media environment. Netflix has already been mentioned. Netflix plays to niches in a way that public service broadcasters probably can't anymore. Netflix has 90,000 different meta tags in terms of types of content that people can get. PSB's traditionally played in the space of kind of large national public events. Large national public events like sporting rights, they're becoming ever more expensive, making it difficult for PSBs to broadcast that sort of content. So again, they're not in that space that they used to be in before. Media is becoming more personal. The handset, the phone is the way that people are consuming media. PSBs are traditionally about broadcasting big messages, big national messages, educating the public with a broad suite of content. As the kind of filter bubble generation continues, it's difficult to see how the BBC will cope in that world. It also has to span analogue to digital, so broadcast TV, radio, right through to the youngest licence fee payers who are consuming everything through handsets. There is growing political opposition to a compulsory payment and the criminalisation of people who don't pay for a licence fee. There are private member bills going through the House of Commons. There are reviews by government into compulsory licence fees. All these issues are kind of undermining that traditional model of public service broadcasting, in the UK at least. And then there are digital intermediaries who are having a fundamental effect, I think, on how everyone consumes media. And they're having a fundamental effect on the way that they consume news and how they consume content from publishers like The Guardian, but also how they're consuming news from people like the BBC. So that's the kind of broad context in the UK. There are three issues, overarching themes in the UK that are being discussed. The first is regulation, and I'm also no fan of public value tests. Or there's also a fair trading framework in the UK which we're particularly exercised about at the moment. There's a real question about how you can adequately constrain a public service broadcaster with £4 billion operating in the market. You don't want to be too specific, but at the same time you need to allow the market room to breathe and monetise content. Traditionally in the UK, or the last charter, it was based on a system of public purposes, and then within the public purposes a system of service licences which are a bit more specific. But they are, I would probably argue, they're not fit for purpose. The funding model, as I've already mentioned, the criminal element of the licence fee is coming up for debate. But there are also kind of progressive discussions about whether the licence fee should be extended to cover iPlayer. iPlayer is the big loophole in the licence fee at the moment, in that you can watch iPlayer and not pay for the licence fee, and if you're a younger person in the UK, that's probably what you'll do. So the licence fee is being extended to cover that. And also the BBC is being squeezed in terms of the amount of money it's given by the government, which is impacting on its behaviour elsewhere. So the BBC is becoming increasingly commercial in terms of trying to monetise its content, increasingly aggressive in terms of how it monetises its content outside the UK, and that has an impact on publishers like The Guardian, who've expanded to places like the US and Australia, and I can probably come back to that later. But finally, there's the question of scope, and this is summed up probably in the quote that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, where Strictly Come Dancing has become the litmus test as to whether the BBC should be doing content, and specifically whether Strictly Come Dancing should compete with the X Factor on a Saturday night. And this became a very large public debate in the UK about whether this was an appropriate thing to do. I personally think it should, but that's fine. But the question of scope, obviously, is what should the BBC do and what it shouldn't do in a crowded digital world. So where are we at the moment? One of my O's has dropped, but there we go. So back in July, two select committees of Parliament, one in the Lords, one in the Commons, launched select committee inquiries into charter review. There was a little settlement, which I'll come back to on the next slide, with the Treasury, with the BBC Trust and the BBC Executive. The formal process kicked off in July, August with DCMS, the responsible department of the UK government. They published a green paper, which is kind of a broad sense of what are the big questions that we should be asking the BBC. The Culture Secretary appointed an advisory board of people who had experience of media and not to try and advise him on what should happen to the BBC. And then he launched 3 reviews. The Perry review, which looked at whether the licence fee should be abolished, or the criminalisation of the licence fee should be abolished. The Clementi review, which looked at whether the BBC Trust was fit for purpose, and a review of the BBC's market impact. And those reviews are all ongoing and will feed into the charter review process. In September, the BBC published its response to the Green Paper, which I'll briefly touch on. The BBC Trust responded to the BBC's proposals. In May, we're expecting the DCMS to publish a white paper, which will be a more detailed sense of where charter review should go. And then Parliament will get its hands on all of this and discuss it through till potentially December, when the current charter review expires. As that circle suggests, there have been 192,000 responses to the charter review process so far. Thousands of civil servants have been drafted into DCMS to analyse these responses, and a lot of them were driven by our campaign group. So they're now trying to counterweight that with research, finding out what the UK public thinks. The biggest moment though so far has been in July, a few weeks after the current government was elected. The Chancellor took the BBC's Director General and the BBC Trust's chairwoman into a room and told them they were going to have to cover the costs of free TV licences for over 75s. And at a stroke, that puts onto the BBC a cost of about £745 million from 2020, which cuts their budget by about 20%. So that was a really significant moment in the process. And in terms of the question about funding of the BBC, that's a pretty fundamental change in how they're going to be funded going forward. Through that agreement, there was provisional agreement to tie the licence fee level to consumer price index, although that's not guaranteed. That again was a bone of contention after the meeting. It's kind of an awkward moment where they thought they'd agreed everything, then came out and realised they hadn't. The iPlayer usage was subject to a licence fee. That was a positive for the BBC. And also they got rid of obligations around broadband. But this was very controversial in the UK. Opposition politicians said it was a stitch-up. The BBC was accused of being weak. And it was a moment in the process. And in a way that's kind of undermined the whole process that I set out in the slide before, in terms of if the funding has been cut by such a large amount. How does that impact on actual discussions about what the BBC is for, its scope and remit going forward? And I think it feels now that the debate that we're having is important, but it's missing some crucial elements. The BBC came forward with its own proposals. I won't go through them all here, but some of them are around the news stream item at number 9. That's about moving from rolling news on TV to rolling news on a handset. And that's a really good example of where older licence fee payers were of the view, it's all right if you're doing this for young people, but I don't use a phone, so how are you catering for me? That's an example of the tension there. And also world service, or as I described it last night to colleagues, the colonial service in terms of the BBC's Britain's soft power. The government's given the BBC £85 million a year to expand that as well. So I thought I'd end with a quick case study of news. In the UK, the BBC is still dominant as the provider of news. 56% of people told Ofcom that they use the BBC website or app to access news. So they're pretty much the default destination. And they have a responsibility within their service licences to push consumers out from the BBC website to third-party websites to become the sort of partner that was discussed a moment ago in terms of facilitating onward traffic. They've missed that for the past 2 years by about 20%. But there are no sanctions that have been able to follow from the BBC Trust because they seem to have no ability to force the BBC to take that sort of policy seriously. At the same time, the same Ofcom survey shows that social media has jumped from 17% to 29% in terms of how people consume news in a year. So you can see Facebook is having a real impact in terms of how people consume media. And that kind of world of convergence is leading to social media being the default point of access. And that raises huge questions for commercial publishers like The Guardian, but also for the BBC. The BBC is used to having interventions in the market which enable it to be at Channel 1 on the EPG, to be at Channel 1 on the radio set. How do you make the BBC be at Channel 1 in a world of Facebook? It's quite difficult. And I think that's leading to different behaviours on the part of public service broadcasters. It means that the BBC is more likely to chase an audience with viral stories to the detriment of commercial publishers who are also looking for an audience on platforms like Facebook. And there's a real question about what the role is of PSBs on commercial platforms like Facebook. Should they be giving all their content away for free, or actually should they be holding back and allowing the commercial sector to develop on those sort of platforms or think about how they develop? We're facing a perfect storm in the UK. Print advertising has dipped by about 25% across the industry. Digital advertising has grown by 30%, but 28.5% of that has gone to Google and Facebook. So 1.5% we're scrapping over that, the rest of the market. So you can see the world is changing quickly. Willingness to pay for news in the UK is very, very low. is 75% of people said they wouldn't pay for news in the UK. It's difficult to say that's due to the BBC, but I think having a rich source of news freely available in the UK certainly has an impact on the ability to try and ask people to pay for news. And then when news brands diversify outside the UK to generate revenues and bring them back to invest in UK news content, what we're finding is that the BBC is behind us commercialising its licence fee funded content in the US and in Australia. And here, this is where the fair trading framework comes into play. And here we see, I think, the fair trading framework failing to actually put clear separation between the BBC's public service activities and its commercial activities. And there I think we have real concern about what that means for the BBC's behaviour going forward. And then my last slide is, why does this matter? Why do we need The Guardian, and why do we not just rely on public service broadcasters? Well, this was a story a couple of weeks ago about David Miranda, who was involved in the Snowden story and reporting the Snowden story. You may remember he was arrested at Heathrow and detained by police about what they thought was carrying material. The court case ruled, he appealed against an initial finding. The court ruled that while the police action was lawful, the law itself was incompatible with the Human Rights Act. And this was paragraph 10 of quite a long end to a judgment. For whatever reason, the BBC decided to just go with the fact that the stop and search was lawful. Who knows whether it's to do with the fact that the charter review process is ongoing or whether it's just bad journalism. But I think we took a view as The Guardian, which actually was look at the story a bit deeper, and what you find is it's a fundamental judgment and a significant judgment about the rights of journalists to carry out their work. And you see in these headlines, I think, the sense of why you need a Guardian and you need commercial independent publishers to compete with the BBC and often tell the story in a different way. So that's me.
Thank you. And Matt will also be back for a panel discussion, so if you have questions to Matt, please let me know then. Our next speaker is Arto Satonen from the Conservative Party, Samlingspartiet, and he's also a chairman of the parliamentarian working group that looks at YLE, public service in Finland. Arto, there you are. Welcome up.
Dear audience, unfortunately I don't have headovers, but I would like to tell you a bit about debate which is going in Finland concerning the ILA and media markets. So I'm not an expert. I'm a politician. I'm originally a teacher, but here I'm more a student, because we try to learn from other countries as well. But in our case, I think at first I will tell why there is this kind of a commission where I'm head of, and then the other issue is that what we are doing there, and then what is the role of ILA nowadays, and comparing to other media operators in Finland. So at first I will say there are three reasons why this issue is now on the table in Finland. The first of them is that our private broadcast companies are in a big problems, especially newspapers. And I think this is partly a global problem, because people go for more digitized and it's difficult to get money from there. So that's one issue. Then new players are coming to the advertising markets, like Google and Facebook are very strong in Finland as well. But then there's a third and probably the biggest issue, that Finnish economy is in bad problems, that we have been stable in the last 4 years, and that has meant that there's a big drop in the revenues of the especially the newspapers, and also the private TV companies are in problems in Finland. So that is the one of the reasons. Then the other reason is that because of the problems in the public finance in all over the country, we are making quite big cuts or savings in many different sectors, and then there's of course discussions that should they also concern ILA. So far, to ILA, we have only done so that their budget has been stable. They have been no inflation rising up later, but it has been stable for years, but there has been no cut so far. But that has been like one issue. And the third one is that if we would use more private independent operators to making the programs for ILA, could it mean that we could get more export-oriented industry to that sector? And that's also, I know that's the same question everywhere, but in Finnish case, it's so that in the game industry we are one of the biggest operators in worldwide. So in that case, we're also thinking that probably in this media sector there might be possibilities. So far, ILA is using 6% of its budget, about 25 million euros for buying from the independent operators. But now that discussion is on the agenda, and we already had expert group which was led by Anssi Vanjoki, former vice head of the Nokia company in the time when Nokia did well, and they proposed that that number should rise up to 20% to 2020, which means 100 million euros, and up to 30% later on. So that's like, and that would be like a big issue because they, in that case, the ILA won't have so many or almost very little about their own production, but they would like to be the company which is buying the production from the different operators. That is on the discussion, and it's one of the biggest issues in our system. There are two other research which are now on the way before my committee can make decisions. The first one of them is that there's a research which is looking the international comparison from the different campaigns, and especially in other Nordic countries, also BBC and so on. And then they are also making a research about more deeper analysis about the situation about media markets in Finland. That's going on. And then there is a new research which is just starting, but it's probably the even more important. It's the one which is looking economic efficiency of the ILA. And that's the first thing in Finland, first time in Finland when we are doing so that we are checking more carefully that if ILA is making the news or MTV or Helsingin Sanomat, what is the cost of the news comparing the quality and things like that. Not very easy to do, but I think it's important material for us. So that is like the main issue. Then the one thing which is I think it's interesting, and if I'm right, it's a unique system in Finland, is that so far all decisions concerning to ILA since 1926 when ILA was started, they have done all important decisions has done by consensus. So it means that this committee, which I'm chairman, there are representing all political parties, 8 different parties, 12 members, 2 from the big parties, 1 from the small parties, and we should make a common solution, a consensus about what we will propose. That's not very easy, but that has been like a tradition in Finland so far that we have done it like this. If I then go a bit more deeper about how ILA is now working. Basically, we have looked very carefully about BBC, Sweden, Norway. So mostly it's operating like there. So I'm not going to that. I'm saving time, but I'm just saying a few words which I think are on the agenda right now. We have in ILA we have 4 national TV channels and 6 radio channels, and the market share in radio for ILA is about 50%. ILA is also quite active in social media, in different operators in internet. We are seeing in the way that public broadcast also must be active in internet because they want to attract especially young people, which are using lowest of this ILA. Then of course ILA has an important role for the language minority group like Swedish-speaking peoples in Finland, which are about 5%, Sami, Romani. Also they have news in Russian language because the Russians are the biggest immigration group in Finland and so on. So there are these kind of activities as well, which we have seen important ones. Then probably this funding issue is interesting because we announce we move away from this television license fee 2012 when we came to this media tax. And what was the reason? Of course, there were two reasons. Of course, the different way to use media was one issue, that there were more people who used ILA service but didn't watch TV. And then even more, there were people who watched TV but they didn't want to pay about that. And that was the reason why we go away from it. And now we have a system that we are collecting 500 million euros per year in a way that people are paying by person media tax, which varies from 50 euros to 140 euros, depending how much you earn. And if you earn less than 10,000 euros per year, which is quite low level, then you don't have to pay anything. But that's not a big number. So, and I think that, and then there's also systems so that companies also have to pay. And there has been that has been one issue for the one-man companies, which are saying that they have to pay 2 times themselves and for the company. But in most cases, I will say that this system is widely accepted in Finland. And now it is so that in my committee, that's the only decision we have already made, that we will keep this system alive. So that we don't want to change that more really. Okay, then I think I'm running out of time. But I will say a few words, if it's possible, still about this Vanjoki group. I already thought about that they want to get more private operators working to make programs for Yle, but they also want to show that Yle should work more extensively as a distributor and purchaser of Finnish productions, and the company's online services, which is quite well known, Yle Arena, could be expanded into an open national content platform, which could also help to the newspapers, where they can continue the news which is done there, like in a national. We have to remember that Finland is quite small country, and the resources of the local original newspapers are not very big. One thing I forget to mention is that those radio programs, ILA has also 20 regional radio programs, and they are actually the main competitors with regional newspapers. And old days it was no problem because the other one was a radio, the other one was a newspaper. Now when they both are in the internet, so it's more and more they are in the same field, and that's also an issue what we have to check. But on the other hand, if there won't be ILA there, then there would only be the one regional newspaper, because we don't have to. In every region, we actually have really one newspaper. So in that case, it's also more pluralism in that way. So I think that is what we are now trying to do. Also, we are looking to how we should governance the Yle. Now the system is so, and that will be my last point, that Yle has a board. ILA has a board, which is concerned about experts. They are media experts, they are business experts, and so on. But then there is the administrative body, which is come from the parliamentarians. But I would say that we are not very happy for because there are two different operators, and we don't know actually who is actually taking the care of the responsibility about governance. So it's not very we are seeing it's not very effective system in this way. Actually, it means that ILA is working quite independently, leading by the officers of the ILA. So I think if we want to have more, it's more controlled by the owners. We have to find another kind of solution or develop this system we have now. But thank you.
One question. Thank you very much. I just have one question. You mentioned funding and this media tax, and I know, for instance, in Sweden there is a fear in public service that with the tax there is a risk that politicians will sort of change taxes and so on, and in a way have an influence on media. Has this been discussed in Finland?
Yes, but
maybe closer to the microphone.
Yes, but like I said, we have this consensus background. So it means that if we will change the tax system, every parties must be unanimous, thinking it about same way, and I think it's almost impossible to that way. Okay, there was in last autumn. There was a discussion that when we frozen the money for the ILA in Parliament, there was discussion that some parties were not very happy about that, and so that we should consult about a little bit more and more. But 1 year earlier, it was done so that all the parties were the same. So it's not big difference actually. It was more that the opposition wanted to do that, like a little political issue about that, because it has been so that every time everybody has to say for that. So I would say that risk, and the other risk, what I think that many people are saying, that if there's a tax, then government wants to, do it so that the ILA cannot be so independent. Then that issue is not any case in Finland. Everybody agrees that ILA is totally independent about how it's making news and things like that.
Yeah. So all in all, you think, and there seems to be consensus, this tax system works well.
I think so, yeah.
Arto, thank you very much. We'll also be back. I now give the floor to Bernt Olufsen, who was editor of VG, Verdens Gang, and also chairman of the Norwegian Public Service Committee. Welcome up.
Thank you. Just to make a small correction, I was chairman of the committee within the Norwegian Business Media Association, not a governmental committee. But let me first introduce you to some of the fundamental goals of the Norwegian government, which consists of a coalition between the Conservative Party and the Progress Party. But these goals are supported by the majority of the parliament. And that is to modernize the media policy through equal conditions for all media, regardless of their technological platforms. And it's to reform the support of traditional media and reduce it. It is to dismantle the regulation of media ownership by law and reintroduce the normal procedures of competition authorities. And it is to introduce equal taxations for print media and digital media through a common law VAT. To produce a parliamentary white paper regarding the license fee for the public broadcasting, and to research for alternative funding, and to increase the number of external productions sent by the NRK. Okay. And the major point, they say very clear, to limit the opportunity for NRK to use its very robust governmental funding to weaken the positions of free media enterprises in the private sector. And this was the theme for this commission I headed 1.5 years ago. The key question for us was to what degree we should allow the state to operate in a private media market. A modern democracy need to fine-tune the balance between state-owned public service and private media. We are now operating on common digital arena where different media converge. And we see how there are new user patterns developing and new revenue streams coming. And the members of the Media Business Association in Norway feel that their businesses are increasingly operating in direct or indirect competition with the state broadcaster, and that their fields for development and innovation are narrowed. A true democracy demands a fine balance between state media and private commercial media businesses. This is a matter of principles to us. The state should primarily cover necessary needs in society that the commercial media cannot or will not fulfill. And the borderlines should be governed by law and regulations. The main task for the national broadcaster has been to supply our population with a high quality and diversified service for radio and television, to increase the level of common knowledge and strengthen our language, culture, and identity. But since the year 2007, NRK has had a mandate to develop a popular license-financed service on new digital media platforms. NRK can reach out to 90% of the Norwegian population, and nearly a quarter of all Norwegian journalists and editors are now employed by the state. From 2008 to 2014, NRK increased the editorial staff with 10%. And as you know, we have been downsizing the private sector the same period with 9%. That makes a huge difference. NRK's license financials now go up to 5.4 billion Norwegian crowns. And from 2007 till 2011, the increase in license funding was 26%, with 5% in Denmark and Sweden by comparison. During the last couple of years, the revenue stream to our private commercial media houses have changed dramatically. They used to be mainly financed by revenues from advertising, but now they are highly dependent on revenue from user payment. The NRK clearly weakened the positions of private media in the user market through its similar free digital news service. The web pages of the leading daily Aftonbladet and NRK are complete lookalikes. NRK produced some 80,000 text-based articles last year. This will clearly weaken our position in the reader market. NRK have established a too dominant position in the market, and from our point of view, they can therefore threaten media diversity. In recent years, NRK have been granted the right to establish a very unhealthy competition in the market, even the right to publish a digital newspaper financed by advertising. However, NRK has refrained from this a few years ago. NRK was also given an opportunity to finance its core task through commercial activities and services. The position of the Media Business Association is that NRK core activity should be limited to the publishing of radio and television on all platforms. A national state-owned broadcaster cannot do commercial businesses. And we stress very much that NRK should have an independent responsibility to commit for Norwegian media diversity. And that they should have the obligation to closely monitor their own activities by comparison to the private sector, the competition effect of their services. However, we also think that the whole framework of broadcasting conditions should be reconsidered so that governance is adjusted to our new media reality. NRK should have less detailed regulation within competition limits and enjoy full editorial freedom. A new governance model is needed that separate the role of the owner / General Assembly, the Minister of Culture, and the regulatory structure. A more effective control system have to be introduced. The government has published a white paper that also focuses on the NRK's independent responsibility to ensure the media diversity in Norway. And this is the only victory for the Media Publishing Association so far. But I think it's an important one. It also stresses the important task for a national public broadcaster to add more value to a democratic society, even though public service broadcasting can include popular programs. A public service broadcaster should be universal on all platforms. The main ideal goal will be preserved, but the status should be less detailed. And the parliament should play a more executive and distant role towards the media. NRK will be instructed to raise the share of Norwegian music and also increase the share of private external productions. It's up to 40%, I think. And the license tax claim from everybody that owns a television set will be maintained for the rest of this parliamentary period. There is an expert committee working these days that will present alternative sources of finance during this spring. I think it's in April they will finish their work. Anyway, the government will demand more efficient operations within the public broadcasting system. Furthermore, the written permit to sell advertising on the web pages will be withdrawn. Any future commercial service must have close links to the editorial activity of the NRK. And it must be authorized in advance by the media regulator, as it is in Sweden, I believe. Finally, the government has appointed a broad and media representative commission to further explore the field of media diversity in Norway. This committee will finalize its work in the spring of 2017, just ahead of our next parliamentary election. So that then it will be a bit unclear what's going to happen with this, I think. According to the mandate, the Commission will also evaluate the total news media market and the financials and the economic supports to various kinds of media. Two important things have already happened. The Parliament decided to ditch the special legislation for media ownership. The government will introduce a platform neutrality for taxation of the media at the level of 0 for news media. This will be effective from March 1st this year. And Norway then will become the first European country, I think, with 0 VAT for news media in Europe. The extra money will be used to strengthen the quality of journalism. The NRK reporters just asked us whether we should now give the money back to our readers. That was their angle. But this change in taxations is very helpful to us indeed. NRK is very popular in Norway, and it's very difficult to get a majority for huge changes. They have they have a popularity of 80% in the population. Even the license fee system is very popular. It's supported by 73% of the Norwegian population. And they have a market share now extending 40%. That's very high. So they have a very strong and dominant position, and it's difficult to rock about it. Thank you for your attention.
Just one question. Thank you very much. So to summarize, if you would describe the situation today for private media in Norway compared to NRK, how would you, just in a few words, what does it look like?
Well, of course, the situation nowadays is very difficult, as it also is in the rest of Scandinavia and most of the European countries. I think the National Union of Journalists now have lost 1,000 members in the recent years. And even the NRK, since the growth of the funding has been slowed by Parliament, not frozen, but there is not a strong growth anymore that it used to be. Even the NRK has had to reduce its staff with more than 300 positions over the last couple of years. So it's a very difficult situation. All the figures are are falling, and I think we really have to change all this regime quite dramatically in the future. We cannot have a so dominant state player in our trade as we have today. So, and I don't think it will be sustainable either. We were shown here that the public service media, they are so broad now, even though there are a lot of niche activity and offers going on. And this will not, we cannot have this broad approach by the state to the market in the long run. It has to be narrowed to the more basic needs of the population, I think.
Bernt, thank you very much. So our next speaker is from Denmark. It's Lasse Jensen, journalist and also producer and member of the Danish Public Service Committee.
Well, thank you. To describe the Danish media situation in 13 minutes is virtually impossible. But I shall try. We have a debate in Denmark which is probably more intense than in other Scandinavian countries. That is my impression. It is intense to a point where I would describe it as trench warfare. As in trench warfare during this First World War, there were a lot of casualties, but nobody gained much. So we're not fundamentally different from other Nordic countries. The debate is spearheaded by the branch organizations, which I could compare to the backers of this hearing. It's called Danske Media, Danish media, which consists of all privately owned or commercial media organizations in Denmark. And they have been, for the last 6 or 7 years, very active in trying to promote a debate about, should we say, regulation, funding, and so on, of DR, which is the main public service broadcaster, and also a discussion about the license financing. You can say that this debate, which I should not go into because a lot of the former speakers have already gone into it, especially my friend from Norway, is basically, is the public service broadcasters or the public service media now are they negatively affecting the business of private media? One of the things that we are doing in the Danish Public Service Commission is to try to find out whether there is a negative or a positive effect on the private media, and nobody really knows. There seems to be a certain logic in saying that if public service and state-funded media goes into a market, it will have an effect. But there are British studies, there is a small Norwegian study that shows there doesn't seem to be evidence of a massive negative effect in England. And I know that study was funded by the BBC. In England, they said there's actually a positive effect of the BBC's presence and scope in the market. In Denmark, when I say trench warfare, there are not a lot of casualties. There's a lot of noise. The only part of the debate, DR, the main public service broadcaster, has remained virtually silent. And in my view, and that's my personal view, I'm not a representative of the committee. I'm a private person, I'm a journalist, a media journalist, and a former news executive from both TV2 and DR. That DR has maintained a general attitude, which is everything should basically be as it always has been. Of course, there's been changes since 1925 when DR was founded. But DR's position is, well, we'll continue as always and have done small concessions. One was done a few months ago when DR, who had established an almost commercially booking agency for speakers and so on, mainly DR, famous DR journalists, but in competition with private booking agencies, they actually closed down that agency. But that was only a very small step. Public service broadcasting has become more market-oriented, as it has all over. It is in Denmark X Factor, the British show, which is also part of the discussion, as my colleague from Britain said. So it's basically, should public service be very broad? Should it include entertainment like X Factor and ballroom dancing and things like that? Or should they concentrate on opera, Mozart, debates, news, and so on? Those are the two opposite views. But generally, politically and popularly, I think that there is a huge majority for the broad public service definition. Where Denmark is different is, of course, that government-owned media plays a much more massive role, or has a much more massive part of the market than it has elsewhere. That is because in 1988, in order to provide competition for the main public service and the only monopoly broadcaster, Parliament decided a competition should be established, and just to make sure that nothing happened, they maintained ownership of that opposition, which is TV2. The only difference is that TV2 is organized like a private business with stockholders and so on, abiding by the laws and regulation of every other business is owned in the same way. But the only difference is that 100% of the shares are owned by the state. But if you look at the Danish TV market, I shall not go through all the figures, but I mean, if you look at those two big chunks down there, that 69.8% of the TV market is owned is state-owned companies. The difference between DR, 100% license financed, TV2, almost 100% financed commercially through advertising and subscription. As you see, our Swedish friends in MTG Group has a very small share, about 10%, Discovery Networks about 10%, and others, that's all the other 65 channels on my cable box, have about 8%. So that makes the opposition and some of the more aggressive participants in the debate saying there's only one other country in the world that has a media market like Denmark, and it's North Korea. If you look at radio, that's interesting as well. Here, DR and one interesting and I think very special Danish invention. It's a little bit, I mean, it's sort of the media market Lego of sorts called Radio 24/7. That was done by a former government who said Danish radio needed competition on talk radio. So they put out a bid and saying, are there any private organizations, commercial organizations who would like to run this radio? We will pay everything through the license fee. And in the beginning, 2 or 3 big media companies were interested. The biggest, JP Politiken, withdrew, and there was only one that offered, that gave in a bid, Berlingske Media, and they got it, and they've now been running it for 4 years, and they have 2.2% share in the market. But as you see here, again, the state has a massive presence in the radio market. But of course, the new battleground is the internet, as we all know, and has been stated many times. It used to be such, in my youth, it was very peaceful. I mean, radio and television was the state, and newspapers and magazines were privately owned, and they had each their little country. And now this huge country with very, very big mineral resources and money appeared in the middle, and they're all fighting about it, the internet. And if you look at web usage, does the public service stations, and I now include TV2, do they have a dominant role? Well, look at the figures. Basically, when it comes to daily users, the 2 tabloid newspapers in Denmark, Ekstrabladet and BT, are much bigger, have a good and strong role. When it comes to monthly users, TV2 and DR has a pretty, not a dominant, but a strong role. When it comes to page views, again, the tabloid papers are much bigger than the public service broadcasters. And but when it comes to who threatens who, the debate in Denmark is very much DR and TV2 to a certain extent is threatening the private market. That may be so. But everybody seems to agree, and in the commercial market there's big disagreement between those who publish and those who distribute as to who is the enemy, so to speak. And if you look at the advertising market, and these figures correspond to figures in a lot of other countries, you will see that the dailies have gone steadily down in their share of the advertising market, which hasn't grown considerably for the last 4 or 5 years. That the dailies have gone down pretty much, from almost 3.2 billion Danish kroner to now 1.2 billion Danish kroner. The same goes for magazines and annual publications and outdoor, but the internet, that is, as you may imagine, the pale green stripe, the internet has grown to gigantic proportions of the market. And of that, about 4 billion kroner, Google alone has a turnover in Denmark of 2.2 billion. That is 1 billion kroner more than the total advertising revenue of all newspapers in Denmark. As a little remark, I noticed that the British government has done an agreement with Google that they should pay back taxes to the extent of about 130 million pounds or something like that. In Denmark, with a turnover of 2.2 billion kroner, expected this year to grow to 3 billion. Last year they paid 3 million kroner in taxes. I would love to have a tax percentage like that, because they invoice everything out of Ireland, and that is legal. Anyway, so in the technicality of Danish media policy is regulated every 4 years. There's a tradition of consensus like in Finland. And all the parties who can agree make a 4-year agreement of this should be the way media is public service should be regulated and financed over the next 4 years. We are sort of in the middle of that period. There's a continuing debate. And then in order to prepare for the next media agreement, which is due by the end of 2018, the government and the Ministry of Culture then formed this committee, which I'm happy to be a member of, a public service committee, which is, so to speak, an expert committee. We were immediately under flag from the industry because a number of the members of the committee have been working with public service, DR and TV2, and well, I'll be 70 years old this year, and I probably spent about 30 years of my professional life with DR and TV2, which are the only places you can learn about public service. You can learn to hate it, and you can hate to love it. That's up to you. But basically, the advantage of this committee, I think, is that I've also been in committees which had representatives from every corner of the society, like the new Norwegian committee. And the interesting thing about the work in a committee like that is from first minute of the first hour of the first day, it's a negotiation to find out, what can we agree on. We don't have that problem. I will go, politically, the present government has been shown to be more attentive to the demands of the private sector, which are the biggest demand at the moment. They have been changing over the years, is that DRDK, the DR website, should have a login for all users. In that way, to have the same restrictions for users, so to speak, than all other websites in the private sector have. DR has rejected this offer, which you can argue is against one of the basic principles of public service, which is accessibility for the public. So there's also the debate which ended in Finland in 2012 about license financing versus tax or subscription. In my view, subscription has no future in Denmark in the near future. There's no political majority for that. There may be a move towards a tax-type financing because the Danish license system is incredibly unfair. If you are a poor student, you pay the same as a millionaire. And the same is about 300 euros or 2,200 kroner a year, which is a considerable amount for a student, so to say. So what we're doing in the committee is that we have to produce not a report that makes recommendations, thank God. We have to study the situation, try to describe it, and in essence, produce 4 or 5 or whatever number of scenarios. I mean, on regulation, funding, so on and so forth, saying, of course, the first scenario is, what if nothing happened? What do we think will happen on the internet, for the private sector, for public service? What will happen if we cut the license fee and reduce DR, which may be a good idea? What will happen if we also involve the other support for private media, which gets about 1 billion kroner in direct and indirect support from the government in Denmark? So it's a wonderfully complicated piece of work. We're in the middle of it. And a final point is, of course, essential to this discussion is, excuse my Spanish, what the hell is public service? What is public service versus what you in Sweden have a wonderful word for called publicistik? One publicistik, or publicism, is sort of a very broad definition of media that contributes to society in any way the media is to the information, to the entertainment, and so on, where public service is directly linked to financing. But finding a definition, we're in the middle of that discussion, and it's a very interesting discussion. But before we can actually define and make a rather sober definition of it, it's almost impossible to continue this debate on a reasonable background. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you will also be back for the panel discussion. One more speaker before we have a break, and that is Nils G Indahl. from the think tank CEPOS in Denmark.
Hur spelar du av den? Så liten skrift. So, all right, sorry. Thank you. Good morning. I'm at the Center for Policy Studies in Copenhagen, which is a private institution, receives no state money. We are a public policy institution, and our project is called Media Reform. And I'll say a little about what it is. I'll be making 3 points. First, I'll be mentioning some structural changes in the market for state-owned media companies that affects the ability of state companies to operate. I'll say a little about the crowding out effect. And thirdly, I'll say a little about how we can ensure competition for higher quality in public service. In our city, Greater Copenhagen, we are in 2 countries, Sweden and Denmark. And now we can still go to work in 30 minutes. When we go back, it takes an extra hour because Sweden has introduced 2 border controls on the way. If you look at the map, you can see all the lights at the bottom. That is Greater Copenhagen. And because we live and work in a transnational region, we sometimes need to watch television on both sides of the border. What happens if I want to watch Swedish television in Scania is that I get this message that the program can only be seen in Sweden. And we thought that Scania was part of Sweden, but in this sense it is not. Because I use a Danish mobile company called 3. I have a Danish IP number, and therefore I'm blocked when I'm on the Swedish side of our city. Now there is a proposal from the European Commission that geotagging will be forbidden. So sometime during this year probably, it will be impossible to deny me as a European citizen the right to watch all of BBC's content. That would mean that the BBC can no longer carve up the European market, international markets. Anybody who can understand English or Danish can then access all of the programs at DR or SVT or the BBC. And that is going to change the way that these companies get private finance. So geo-blocking will matter during this coming year. Lasse and some other speakers mentioned that the total newspaper circulation is not doing so well. We can see that the number of daily newspapers is falling, and that is a problem for public service because half of all the news that the state media companies use in their news bulletins, probably a majority of them, come from the private newspapers in Scandinavia. And so if they cannot deliver, then it will be a poorer place. I'm sorry I didn't translate this slide, but if you see, this is a Danish survey of media types in 2013 compared to 2015. The blue bar is 2013 and the red bar is 2015. As you can see, overall TV usage is falling quite rapidly. The next bar is aviser online, that is newspapers online. That is increasing, so these are private operators. Radio is stable, and then social media, there is a sharp increase in people's consumption of media, now going through, of news, now going through social media. So when we make our policy recommendations, we don't think that public service has to do with being organized as a state media company. To us, public service is what goes on in society during the year. It is newspapers, magazine, blogs, discussions, associations, talking clubs, books, theaters. All of this is public service. And most of these activities are, in fact, not organized or financed by the state, but by private actors in society. A recent report on the media development in Denmark shows that in the group 15 to, well, they say in this report that there are now there's a polarization of TV viewers. The people above 60 are the ones that watch traditional television. And in the group 15 to 29 years, which is where these numbers come from, there was a big increase in streaming. So 43% of younger viewers, they stream television, and 75% of them streamed last week. If we look at what people in general were streaming, we see that Netflix is now the biggest television channel in Denmark. And DR is number 2, and other private operators, such as Viaplay, is quite large. And TV2, as Lasse points out, is a state operator. Not for long, I suppose. Mr. Olufsen mentioned the situation of private employed versus state-employed journalists. And because of the sharp fall in the number of privately employed journalists, these are numbers from the journalist associations, we see that in Norway there is a total of 36% state-employed journalists. In Denmark it is 46%. And if the reduction in privately employed journalists continues, there will, in 1 year or 2 years, the majority of Danish journalists will be employed by the state. We've tried to get the numbers for Sweden, but they've been difficult to find because there are so many inactive journalists in the Danish journalists, and they wouldn't give us the real numbers. So, when we present a number of policy proposals, there are 2 things we want to achieve. We want to limit state domination in the Danish market, and secondly, we want to stimulate private news production so that the younger users that produce news through Facebook, that consume news through Facebook or other social media, we want to ensure that they can get access to privately produced news. And I won't give you all the policy proposals now, but we think that we've started at the wrong end of the stick. We've started by saying that all news production should be through state companies. We haven't stated any goals for our media policies. Maybe it would be more correct to say that if there is a market failure, if people cannot be trusted to buy and choose quality news, if they cannot be trusted with buying quality drama, then the state has to intervene to correct this market failure. And if we're satisfied that that is the case, then anybody who produces quality journalism, whether they do it on Facebook, on YouTube, or on other channels, should be allowed to access to this state money that today goes to SVT and DR and NRK exclusively. And that is one of the things we want to look at. How can that be encouraged? We have looked at the ideas that were established in the West around 1650, when the UK was a dictatorship and people were in exile in Flanders to avoid their head being cut off. The essential thing when developing the freedom ideas in the West was to ensure an area where the state was excluded. Why should the king not own the newspapers? Why should the state not own the media companies? Well, that was the idea of freedom of information, that the state should be excluded from this area. That was freedom of information. Josiah Berlin, the political philosopher, he says there are two kinds of freedom. One is negative freedom. That is, and this was the idea of the liberal constitutions, that this was to be a space that was free from state influence. The state was excluded from this space because it belonged to the citizens. And he defines positive freedom as what we fill this space with. How do citizens exercise their freedom in public service that I mentioned a moment ago? And this is where we want to lead the discussion. We want to look at how we think that this space has to be reinstated somehow. Maybe the state should not be completely excluded, but there needs to be more space for the citizens and less space for the state in this area that we call freedom of information. That is our view. And so, because of these technical developments, because of user patterns, the state companies cannot continue like before. We want to encourage private actors, and we will make some policy proposals during February in that respect. And the goal has to be that the state identifies some goals of media policies, and then a payment model which can ensure that anybody who contributes to quality content can be paid for it. So that is that will be our conclusion.
So can I ask you, I mean, this conclusion is, I would say, I don't know if I should use the word radical, but still it's a very new way of thinking compared to the situation today. How realistic is it that this will be a reality within the next few years?
Well, when we mentioned this number that the majority of journalists in Denmark will be state-employed, people that I speak to react. They say, this is not a situation we can have. We have to do something about it. And so limiting somehow the ability of state companies to operate, combined with some kind of stimulation of private operators, that is going to have to be the solution in our opinion.
And
is it realistic? Yes, I think so. I think working with political ideas, if you have to state the ideas, how did they emerge? What is the purpose of them? If you do that, yes, then you can discuss how can we achieve it. And yes, I think it's realistic.
And in just a few words, I realize that's hard, but still, how can you limit the state dominance? What's needed?
Well, there have been some, TV2 Denmark can be privatized, and that's probably going to be a proposal that will be carried out pretty quickly, and that will reduce the number of state journalists. But I think for us, the challenge is really that young users, they don't watch traditional television. And if they get their news via social media, how can we encourage young journalists that are now partly unemployed? How can they produce news that younger users want to receive? I think that is what we should be concerned with, not the legal form of the media company.
Thank you very much, Nils. You will also be back. I will now teach our foreign guests and friends a Swedish word, and that is fika, which is vital in Sweden. That is coffee. So we will now serve coffee, and we'll meet here again at 11 o'clock. See you soon. Welcome back. Even Leonard Cohen, after intermission, he thanks the audience for returning. If he does that, I feel I should do it too. So I'm very grateful that you came back. And we are going to start with first one panel, and after that we'll have two more panels. And now I would like to have some interaction with the audience. If you have any questions, and also if they're very short, some thoughts, but really short. I know this could lead far away otherwise. But if you do that, please just raise a hand and you'll have a microphone in your hand and you can ask questions. Having said that, Karen and Matt, please come back up. And you can use the microphones on the table. So, Matt, I would like to ask you first. You talked a lot about the BBC in your presentation, but you also represent The Guardian. How hard is it for The Guardian today?
Financially?
Yes. And also when it comes to audience or readers or audience.
So, I mean, in terms of readers, the digital world has meant that we've gone from being a regional paper in Manchester to being a national newspaper. We were the 9th largest national newspaper to now being the 2nd largest English-speaking newspaper in the world. So we're read by as many people as the New York Times across the world. So in terms of reach and audience, it's a remarkable success story. Mm-hmm. I think the difficulty this week, we've announced that we're going to have to make quite significant cost reductions in the business. So
sacking people?
No, not necessarily. We've talked about kind of 20% cost reductions, and there's going to be a cost process now over the next few weeks to work out how do we reduce costs.
But how much of these problems, when it comes to finances, is due to competition from the BBC?
So I think it's quite difficult to tell exactly, and there was a report that was mentioned earlier on that the BBC created about the role that they play in the UK news ecosystem, and do they have a negative impact or not. It's incredibly difficult when a public service broadcaster moves first, as the BBC did, into the digital world. There is then no counterfactual to provide which says what is their impact on the market, because the market didn't exist before they moved into that space. So you can't say that the market dropped by X because the BBC had moved in there. But what you can see is increasingly they're the dominant news provider in the UK. They are increasingly creating content which is more magazine style in nature. So they're not just producing kind of international, impartial, timely news. They're also producing literally a section of their website which is called Magazine, which has articles like "Why do Finnish babies sleep in boxes?" which I'm still yet to get to the bottom of. My favourite public service article was the 10 best Oscar put-downs ever, which I was like, why is the BBC creating that sort of content? It seems that's the sort of BuzzFeed viral content that the commercial sector creates, and the BBC is increasingly moving into that space. So you see them competing for audience in the UK, and I think we've got concerns about their remit there. Where we really have concerns is even if we've accepted that the BBC has an impact in the UK market, if we go outside of the UK and we try and commercialise our content in the US and Australia, to find the BBC behind us competing for exactly the same audience, competing for exactly the same advertising and sponsorship, that's very difficult, because we don't necessarily believe we're doing that on fair terms and on a level playing field. And there you have really serious concerns about whether fair trading questions are being brought in to bear. So I went before a select committee and they asked me what is the number in terms of the impact that the BBC has on The Guardian. I couldn't tell you, but you can sense there is a problem there, and it's probably only going to get bigger.
Yeah, Karen, can you console Matt, or should he be even more nervous than he
I
seems to be?
I don't know if he needs consolement, but I would like to support him on the issue of the BBC in international markets. I mean, you can still discuss about the role of public broadcasters in domestic markets, and there you see that also in markets where newspapers actually moved first, that there are also difficulties, and difficulties are as big as in other markets. But if you see what the BBC is doing in international markets, I think it's so incredibly market distortive, and not only for UK players.
Can you be concrete? What do you think of?
Well, not only in news, but what I have been researching, for example, is the sales of content. Great UK drama and great British television, and it's all fantastic, so they say, and market. But it's very... Well, what you see is that they have so enormous export policies that for small public broadcasters and even commercial broadcasters in Belgium, Austria, Ireland, it becomes very difficult to go against this BBC dominance in international markets. It's like a lot of public broadcasters used to buy a lot of content from the BBC, like the Earth documentaries, but also drama series. But what you see now is that they are negotiating to establish pay channels in a lot of these European markets. So they're actually bypassing the public broadcasters that have subsidized them for millions and millions of money, just because they treat the international marketplace as like one big commercial avenue. That's the role of the BBC worldwide. And there's virtually, in my opinion, no control or no significant control of what BBC worldwide is doing, which is, to me, kind of showing this bit of sense of, if I may, British supremacy, you know, Britannica rules the wave kind of attitude. But
Got very cold in here.
But I think in this you will forgive me for the statement, but it's actually...
Maybe he agrees.
It's under-researched, it's, I think, potentially very dangerous, but not only for UK media companies, but also for media companies in other European and even outside European markets.
So, yeah, I think that actually goes to the heart of the BBC's big strategic question, which is how do they maintain their brand in a world of Facebook and Netflix? And the BBC does not want to be a content provider to Netflix. It wants to be a channel on its own, sitting in, whether it's in Belgium or Germany or anywhere in the world. It wants the BBC brand to stand out from those kind of intermediaries and platforms. And that's why I think they're moving from selling individual programs to creating what they would call a product, which is those channels. And it's the very odd thing about being in Britain is that when you talk to politicians about the BBC, certainly on the centre right of the political spectrum, they hate the BBC in the UK with a passion. But as soon as you talk about exporting the BBC, they're like, oh, it's amazing, you know, it's brilliant. You know, it's British soft power, it's kind of, you know, it's Sherlock, it's Doctor Who, it's all of these great brands which tell the story of Britain on a global stage. So if you're kind of talking to politicians about the BBC, it's quite difficult to get them to engage in actually the potential harm that they're doing to players such as The Guardian, because they don't necessarily always... We have a tendency to reveal unpleasant truths about life, and so the politicians aren't always as keen to support The Guardian as they might be to support exports of British content.
But Karen, can you console Matt with I mean, the EU, or not only Matt, a lot of people in here, how big hope should people put on Brussels now and the EU when it comes to helping the private sector in the media business?
Well, although I'm Belgian, and so we are absolutely pro-European, I don't think we should put too much hope in Brussels.
Why not?
Well, we've had a lot of procedures, I think up to 30, bit more than 30 stated investigations into public service broadcasting. And well, first we have to keep in mind that over half of these do not really concern the questions we have been talking about today. A lot of them deal with funding, like in Portugal and Italy, which is about debts and debts restructuring and, you know, financial corruption, more or less, if I can say that in this audience.
It's on the internet now too.
But if you look at all the other decisions, then you do see that some things have been opposed, like the public value test principle. But I've explained in my presentation that, you know, it's not really working out in practice. I've done lots of interviews with private companies also in the UK like with ITV, Channel 4, Telegraph Media Group, but also in Germany, in the Netherlands, who all say we don't believe in it anymore. We would never invest in a state aid procedure anymore because you invest lots of money because the lawyers come at a cost, and it's not paying off. You also see with state aid control, it's also going in waves. So we had a peak like 5-6 years ago with lots of decisions. Now we know there's some formal procedures, like for Poland, for example, and some informal, of which we formally do not know, but we do know that they are going on. I expect more complaints because the more frustrated private competitors get because of the national situations, the more they feel pressured to go to Brussels. But quite frankly, I think that's a waste of time. And I also think that member states should not be waiting until Brussels forces them to do something. They should just take responsibility themselves and make sure that they have decent public service media policies in place.
And would you say, because, I mean, in the Nordic countries, for instance, public services, you can hear that today, public service is very big. And there is, I guess, some nervousness among politicians to do too much to take more control of public service. Is this the case, would you say, in all the EU, not only in the Northern European member countries?
No, actually, I don't think that politicians are in a lot of countries afraid to tackle public broadcasters. I think in some countries, like the UK and also Belgium and the Netherlands, they're actually trying to cut budgets and try to achieve some results in that way, which I'm not sure is the best way, because sometimes, like in Belgium, it's about cuts like up to 20%, which obviously is a bit different when you have 400 million or you have 3 billion. There's some difference there in terms of what this 20% represents. But I don't think that politicians don't dare to touch public broadcasting, but the system is so old that it's also terribly resistant to change, which is the case with all big organizations, public or private. But the least you can say is that politicians have an ambiguous relationship with public broadcasting. They often consider it too leftist, which is something you hear in each and every country, for which there is no evidence whatsoever, but anyway, it's considered that way. But you do see several countries, like also Germany, Austria, Switzerland. I wouldn't say they have any fear there, or in the Netherlands, to curb public broadcasters' activity. But the wrong focus, I would say. But, bit short term.
Matt?
I mean, I mentioned the July settlement between the Treasury and the BBC. I think there is, a lack of imagination, I think, on the part of politicians about how do you regulate public service media. I think that's because a lot of the service licenses and public purposes, they're very nebulous in terms of what they actually allow the BBC to do. So they find it very difficult to work out how do you regulate a body like this. So they think the best way to regulate it is by not giving it or cutting budgets. I think actually what that does is it changes the incentives for the BBC to become more commercial elsewhere in the organisation. And in a way that's even worse for the commercial sector, because you have a BBC which has an unclear remit and unclear service licences, and then you have an appetite on the part of the BBC to go off and commercialise its products elsewhere. And that's where I think they bump against the market even more aggressively. And I think the thing that really disappointed me was the BBC's had 10 years to think about what it's going to do through charter review. Now, that's not an insignificant amount of time. And I think everybody can see that ultimately the direction of travel for the BBC is working out a new model of public service broadcasting that doesn't rely on the licence fee. But it seems to be that it's basically been put into the too hard pile. So it's too difficult to do. Therefore, what they've decided to do instead is privatise BBC studios, become more aggressive to BBC worldwide, get money here and there for world service from the government. And what you have is a very unclear vision about what the BBC is for, and a kind of political settlement which is based on cuts and not really any kind of vision for what the BBC is about. And that's not satisfactory for the BBC. I don't think it's satisfactory politically, and I don't think it's satisfactory for the market. And so, that's not great.
Did you want to? I have a question for you. I thought you wanted to comment. I mean, we have a lot of people from media in this room. Your piece of advice would be not to go the EU way when it comes to trying to save or boost the private sector in media. It's not the way. No.
Well, I haven't seen it work anywhere.
No, and too expensive, too time-consuming.
Yeah, and I for my research, I because you see a lot of research and that is very much pro-public service broadcasting, and I think it's fair to say that. But I also did lots of interviews in various countries with private media companies, and even they acknowledge that lots of these like fashionable regulatory instruments basically didn't work. So we can be very stubborn and follow this path, or we can try to invest in something that might turn to be a bit more productive. And I really think collaboration is the way to go, and it was a bit frustrating when I saw that BBC is not really delivering very well always.
And
in
when
that
you say
regard.
collaboration, what do you mean?
Well, for example, just to give one example, in Flanders, the public broadcaster is sharing video with newspapers and also merely online journalistic initiatives. This project took a lot of time because obviously there is a lot of mutual distrust, which is very often also justified. But what happened was a bit of pragmatism on the side of everyone, but also government, because newspapers and other online initiatives said, yeah, we want the video, but we do not want to pay for it, and we want to be able to commercialize it, which is something governments do not like, the idea of advertising in front of public broadcast video. So the solution they came up with is that these companies can take video from VRT, they can commercialize it, they can put a pre-roll in front of it, they have to give a small split to VRT to cover the costs of the service, basically, or in the case of very small online initiatives, and that might be an interesting one relating to what you said earlier. They can use the commercial services of VRT or other big print agencies to do the commercialization, because if you're very small online journalistic initiative, you normally do not have the infrastructure to do this. And this system is actually working very well. All print companies in Flanders are associated with this initiative within 6 months or so. Once the principles were worked out, it went very, very fast. Only problem, the big commercial television broadcaster in Belgium is absolutely opposed because they had a monopoly in this market. They also asked outrageous prices to newspaper companies. And they now say, well, now the public broadcaster is distorting our market. So that's a bit a tricky thing with collaboration initiatives in the UK, in Ireland, in Netherlands, in Belgium, is that once you please like one sector, you always have a problem in another one. So it's not an easy way to do it. But I think there's certainly good examples of where it definitely works.
Yeah. Matt, I mean, you represent The Guardian, one of the giants in Britain. But if you look on smaller media companies, what's the situation for them when it comes to competition from the BBC, for instance?
So there have been a couple of instances over the past year where the BBC has believed there is market failure in local journalism and stated that it needs to set up a service to cover those areas. And it's kind of self-prescribed market failure, which has not gone down particularly well with local newspapers. The reality is that a number of local newspapers are moving from print to digital. So a lot of their operations are now online only. Just as the BBC's operations will be online only if they opened up in areas of the UK. I think there has been a level of frustration amongst local media. I think they're working through some of that with the BBC at the moment. The BBC is beginning to do a more progressive linking policy to local content via a product called Local Live. And then they are sharing more video with local providers as well.
And is that enough for the smaller media companies to feel more safe?
I think there's a number of areas that we have in common with the locals, which is the lack of attribution to stories that the BBC gives. It was a point made in your presentation, I think, in terms of the number of stories that are produced by the commercial press and then are taken up by the public service broadcasters. I think there's a high level of frustration about that. And the high level of frustration about the lack of the BBC's willingness to push people out to those local news websites so that they realise that it's a commercial local newspaper that's invested in that story. Local media is going through a series of structural problems anyway in the UK, as in the rest of the world, in terms of the kind of impact of Google and Facebook. So I think anything the BBC can do to help in that area is positive, but their financial difficulties will be dictated by more than just the relationship with the BBC.
once again, if there are any questions from you, just raise your hand and you can ask them. Are we Yeah, sorry. Did you have a question? Yeah, sure.
No, I just wanted to add to what Karen said. One of the main reasons that TV2 in Denmark has not been privatized is that the commercial broadcasting stations, MTG and SBS, then now Discovery Networks, have had an ongoing case against TV2 at the EU. Potentially, they risk paying up to or more than 1 billion Danish kroner in returning money that was unlawfully given by the state to a commercial station. That has now been dragging on for, I think, 11 years. And there's no light at the end of the tunnel. That is the blocking of the privatization of TV2, but also an example of what happens if an EU process suddenly, I wouldn't say gains speed, but goes on.
This is, by the way, not exceptional. You have had some shorter cases that took like a year, 2 years, 3 years, mainly related to the UK. But it's certainly not an exception that stated investigations take over 4 or 5 years, and definitely up to 10 or 11 stated investigations that took over 10 years to kind of settle between the member state and the European Commission, because it's kind of, it seems a very legal procedure, but those that have been involved in it know it's more of a politicized negotiation exercise between the member state and the European Commission. So also, I forgot to mention that, but also in terms of, I mean, for a private media company, that's a terribly long, well, it's a terribly long time to wait for anyone, but basically, you know, then you're dead already, in case there is serious market distortion, so...
And to pay lawyers during 11 years is pretty expensive,
well,
I guess.
I don't have anything against lawyers, but it's no secret that European legal procedures are extremely expensive and can go up into several millions.
Yeah, but are we maybe focusing too much on BBC? Should we speak about Google and Facebook and so on? Is that a big threat instead, Matt?
So I think, I think we're all, public service broadcasters and commercial publishers are facing very similar questions in terms of how we survive in a world where our brands are disintermediated by platforms like Google and Facebook, where we're less able to monetize our content through advertising and sponsorship on our own. We're more reliant on initiatives like instant articles or amplified mobile program or Apple News for revenues. But I think that's where the public service view of the world is maintain our brand above all costs, and don't worry about people operating below us in the market. What's really noticeable about the BBC's response to Charter Review is they compare themselves to Google and Facebook. They don't compare themselves to The Guardian or The Times or The Sun. They see their peer group as being those very, very largest platforms. And that, I think, that frames their view of the world, looking up rather than looking down and working with people like ourselves. But I do think that's where... I mean, the BBC nudged towards it in terms of some of their proposals. They say that the BBC should become a platform for British companies and British institutions. If they're going to be meaningful about that, it needs to be more than just the BBC doing a partnership with the British Library or with the Tate Museum or with the Royal Opera House. It needs to be actually business people that try and make money. It's a dirty thing to do, I know, but you know, commercial publishers have to make money to invest in content, and I think public service broadcasters like to stay away from those businesses and don't like to have any kind of relationships with them. I think if you're going to see public service broadcasters and commercial publishers actually creating propositions that can compete with Google or Facebook, can kind of maintain share of voice, then there needs to be much more collaboration there.
Yeah. Karen?
Well, I definitely think we talk too much about the BBC and the UK market in general. Not that it isn't interesting, but it's like the biggest with Germany media market in Europe, very much export-oriented, which is great, obviously, but which makes it not so terribly comparable to the situation of very small linguistic markets that are actually plentiful in Europe. Now, having said that, I agree with the fact that we should focus a bit more on discussions on players in general that are earning money with content but are not investing in content. And I think that's a big issue for public broadcasters, but even more so for private media companies that do make investments in content. And that's not only Facebook or Google News. You have plenty of these companies, the big cable distribution companies that sometimes have dominant positions in some European markets. They are actually reaping the profits of the investments that others are making in content. And I think that that is the big imbalance in the media ecology, and that definitely there should be some attention for that also at the European level, because that's a market that is not really organized at the member state level. So you do see some national initiatives, like in France you have players that need to pay a tax, and that is then going to content investments. Also in Belgium you have a system that television distribution companies have to pay part of their profits to new investments in content, for example. But this is all very, very local, and it's not really solving the issue. So that is definitely something where I see Brussels coming in, if they would have the
muscles,
guts to do so.
Yeah. One more final question, I think, before we'll have the next panel. But if we stand here in 10 years and discuss public service and in parallel with private media, what will the map look like? What will we see? Matt, what do you think?
I would find it difficult to predict where we're going to be in 6 months, let alone 10 years.
That's why the question is so fascinating. Just let fantasy flow.
I think mobile will be completely dominant in terms of how people consume media. I think that Netflix seems to me have got first mover advantage, and they will become sort of the Uber platform for content. My worry is that the levers that you have in a traditional world of kind of TV platforms and radio platforms and things that you control physically, spectrum policy effectively, how you can put conditions around spectrum policy, you don't really have those in a digital world. And if it's difficult to make digital players like Google and Facebook pay tax, then it's going to be very, very difficult to enforce obligations on them around how they carry content. So unless there's some pretty radical reform at a European level about the obligations that are on those platforms, you will see ultimately, I think, a number of publishers unable to create sustainable business models, and the number of publishers that are viable reduce.
Dramatically reduced, or just on the margin?
Shall I be dramatic?
Yes.
I mean, moderately dramatic. Yes. But I think the danger is the UK will be probably fine in terms of the content that we produce. We produce English-speaking content which can travel across the world. The issue is going to be in smaller countries across Europe where indigenous production will come under more and more pressure unless there is action taken, I think, at a European level. So I worry less about the UK. I worry more about other parts of Europe.
Yeah, Karen.
Well, I would say that in lots of European countries we already have reached the dramatic point. There are quite a lot of markets where you have 2 big newspaper groups, and that's basically it. So where concentration, the next step is a monopoly, basically, and which is not something I blame the publishing sector for, but which is just the economic reality of trying to realize and achieve some scale. In terms of the public broadcasting discussion, will we have a fundamentally different discussion in 10 years? I know it's a very long time frame, but since I'm paid to read books, I've read lots of them. And I've read books about public broadcasting in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, change of the century and today. And they all talk about public broadcasting under pressure. They all talk about we need to discuss about the remit. In that sense, I think that in 10 years' time, we will still have discussions, but obviously in a fundamentally different context. But I wouldn't say that then in 10 years' time, we're all friends and there are no discussions on public service media anymore. I do think that local media brands will survive. That's my strong belief, because they're trust brands. And I think we shouldn't underestimate how much people kind of trust not only the public broadcaster but also local news media that they have known for several years, several decades. So that kind of makes me hopeful. But perhaps I'm right, probably I'm wrong. We'll see about that.
One very short comment from.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, the trend you see in Europe is a few years ago, it was basically there was a split between people who created networks and they sold off their content assets. I worked for one of those businesses, it was called Virgin Media. What you're seeing now is a number of very big networks buying content assets. So I think what you'll see in 10 years is there will be a number of organisations that own both networks and content.
Yeah.
And the question you have there is, like the issues of net neutrality come into play much more in that kind of scenario, because you have gatekeeper scenarios where those networks can decide what comes on and off their networks. So I think that area of regulation will become even more important for content providers.
And very often, if I may, very briefly, non-European players, like Liberty Global, active in 14 European markets, including UK, but also Belgium, and increasing needs a strategy buying production companies, television broadcasters, and explicitly saying, is its strategy to occupy content, basically to make sure that people continue to buy cable and internet and mobile telephone subscriptions. And that is something we are completely leaving aside while, focusing on nitty-gritty details about the number of words of public broadcasters online. And not saying it's not important, but I think this is more important because it's at such a structural level.
We have to stop there. Thank you very much, both of you. And I now invite the other speakers to come back up on stage, please. So I thought I would start by asking, if it's an unrealistic question, but I will still ask it, if public service were to be invented today, would it be invented in the form it has today?
Obviously not. I think it was quite a different story when public service was introduced to our markets than what we see today. I think refreshing the question about what's going to be the situation in 10 years from now, well, it's easy to say. I think that we'll all be in public service then.
What do you mean?
That we will all be a part of the of a public service system. It will be our common contribution from lots of different sources, organized in a way that the people can benefit from it in their daily life.
Lasse, do you agree?
Yeah, basically.
Arto?
Yeah, I would say in a way that I also agree that it would be totally different. But I think that purpose of it is still there, but it could be like more in like we are trying to develop it in Finland. That it's more like an organization which is buying programs which are made by the others. And then it's like an organization which is organizing that, but not doing so much for themselves. So I think that would be the main difference.
Niels?
We looked at when the broadcasting companies were established in the 1920s, and they were actually private in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And then they were nationalized by the state. And we have looked at the law proposal in Denmark. There was no mention of news because the news was taken from private newspapers, and the Act of Parliament states that, or in the preparation for it, they state that only the state can guarantee a balanced transmission of culture to the population. That is their reason for nationalizing the private broadcasting company. So I think you would have to rephrase the question. Would they be nationalized today? I don't know, but I think if we look at what's happening in Hungary and Poland, there can be very good arguments why the state should not be in the media business at all, and why there should be a constitutional protection against state media companies.
But thank you. And Bernt, when you say we'll all be more or less public service, isn't that a very pessimistic view?
Oh, you could turn it around and say it is an optimistic view.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think we are all moving towards a media society which is fragmentized, and we can pick what we need from different kind of sources. The problem is to develop a sustainable business model in all this, and that will be the greatest challenge for the media industries in the years to come, I think.
Lasse?
Yeah, I think, the great challenge, and Matt was mentioning it, is of course how to protect the national language and national culture and so on against this onslaught from abroad, so to speak, especially the United States. That you now have, and I think also that Matt, you mentioned that in the future, public service companies owned by the state or not owned by the states, because ownership in this country, Channel 4 is a public service company, but not owned by the state, will go more and more hand in hand with commercial national companies in order to protect vital interests of the nation, so to speak. It sounds a little bit highbrow, but in a sense that when you look at what Apple is doing, what Google is doing, what Facebook is doing. I was in America in November and interviewed the new CEO of Verizon, AOL's content division. Verizon, which basically is a very, very rich telephone company, bought AOL, which, among others, owns the Huffington Post, and is now putting it all under one umbrella. And we're here talking about serious financial muscle, and will create a content. They will not necessarily create their own content, but they would like to control the content in its lifetime and in this distribution sense. And that's where the real threat lies for small countries. Because we don't have the money. No matter how much money we pool, it will be very difficult to compete against this without public funds. Danish drama, and to a certain extent Swedish drama on television, Nordic noir, is an example of something that in small areas but still globally can compete, but it would not exist without government money or license money. It would not, because it's not financially feasible in the market.
Arto?
Yeah, I agree with what you said just last. It's especially the same in Finnish drama, which is even more
more gloomy.
Not so
more Finnish.
More Finnish and more. We are even. I suppose other Scandinavians at least understand each other much better than we do others. So and then there's of course this question of market failure, that there are like in the case of Finland, if we have like 5% of Swedish-speaking population, there will be any business markets for that. Okay, they are still following quite a lot of, for example, by internet, the Swedish evening papers and so on. So it's like partly, but still, if they're living in Finland, they want to know what is happening in Finland, and that's like so. And also like the children's programs are the issue in Finland, that it's very difficult to get money on them, but it's important that there is this kind of program. So at least this market failure issue is there, but then the one thing we have discussed a lot is that how much more you have to do. You have to be in a big sport event, and do you have to be like in doing the very good drama where you are competing with the commercial channels. So I think these questions are where you put how high you put the goal. I think that will be the interesting issue as well.
Yeah. Nils?
I think the state companies would benefit from more competition. One example is Swedish Radio, which buys a lot of programs from private journalistic companies, and I think that is something that the state companies could learn from, and also expand to the television field, and also to the online field.
I would like to make a little poll with you four here. On a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is calm, everything is okay, and 10 is being terrified. From a point of view of the private sector, how nervous or calm are you? 1 to 10, Bernt?
I think it's safe to say 5.
Very Swedish or Nordic. Yes. Nils, be more brave.
8.
8. Arto.
6.
6.
I don't know. I'm not in the business sector. So I will not be
But
able to
if you
predict
still would look at that sector to make your judgment.
from calm to perfect
Yeah.
storm.
Or
7,
imperfect.
8.
7, 8. So, I mean, on the whole, you are quite pessimistic.
I think it very much of this will depend on the future scope of the state-owned broadcasters. I don't.
But
believe-
taking that into consideration, I mean, do you trust them enough?
But it depends of the willingness to fund, continue funding that kind of scope they have today. I think it will be possible in the future that they can maintain the broad scope they have today. So I'm not particularly worried about that. I think the market will force them to narrow their scope to meet more the needs you are mentioning of bilingual language and culture and so on, and of course news. Today, 1/3 of NRK's budget is for providing news to people. The rest is, sports, entertainment, expensive shows that Netflix and others can do quite as well as they can, and they are. So I think it's an impossible, not sustainable idea that they can continue that way. And but if they do, then the risk will be even higher.
Yeah.
I think if we see the, for instance, the MasterChef franchise in Denmark, it can be bought by the state company. In Sweden, it can be bought by a private company, and so it is not a public service activity as such.
It's MTG that owns it in Denmark. That's private.
And I think we need to discuss whether the state companies should engage in what is clearly private activities with the taxpayers.
Is that the one of the main answers to these problems, to scale down public service and let them do work in a more narrow way? Lasse?
No, I don't think so. It depends on what you're talking about. I mean, are you talking about...
The chef program is an example.
Well, MasterChef is totally commercial, owned by commercial companies, bought by commercial.
But can be broadcast in a public service company as well.
It can be broadcast in any company that cares to pay for it.
Yeah.
I think that in order to keep public service and to keep in Denmark, for instance, there is not a private company that produces news on television. That, of course, is because TV2 and in. I doubt very much that a private company would be able to produce news of of sufficient quality in a small country like Denmark in the same scope that TV2 and DR can do it. They might be forced to do it by regulation, because you can regulate private companies as well. It's becoming increasingly difficult. But I think, for instance, I mean, what would happen if the whole Danish market was solely privatized? How many news stations would there be that covered the nation and foreign affairs and so on for the whole nation in a professional way? My guess would be one. And is one public service station worse than one privately owned station that is not guaranteed independence, does not have obligations of balance and so on? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure what I prefer.
Yeah, you can hear that. Arto?
Going back to this question, wide or narrow, I think if I'm taking an example of sport and in case of Finland, when we have this media tax, I think it's mostly about how you think it mentally. It's like ILA is thinking so that, and people in ILA and many people also who pay the media tax are thinking that if I pay money which goes directly to ILA, I have to see the Ice Hockey World Championship final from there. But on the other hand, because it's on the regulations that it must become for some channel which is seen by everybody. It doesn't really matters if it comes from the ILA or commercial channels which everybody can see for free. So should be understood that this is this is not only for the ILA, or is it more that we have a brutal media coverage. So I think that's an issue what we have discussed, and that's the one where we have divided opinions in Finland.
Well, basically, I mean, one of the things, as a viewer, as a user, a massive, crazy user of television, I can see something like 60 channels at home. I pay 2,200 krona a year in license, which covers DR, TV2 regions, radio 24/7, plus a number of other things contributing to drama also on TV2 and so on. It cost me 2,200. To see the commercial stations, including TV2 on cable, I pay about 3 to 4 times that amount. Yeah. So I mean, it's not for free. As we know, nothing in the world is for free. You pay for it nowadays.
Yeah, but it depends on which kind of it is organized.
Yeah, it depends on regulations. It depends on the commercial
Niels and then Karen.
I think the age of national news is over, in the sense that lots of Danish news consumers, they understand Polish and German and English, and if you gave them a voucher to buy their news services, I think many people would buy news from ZDF or BBC and not necessarily.
But don't we need national news?
I think, seen from the outside world, I think the Nordic countries or Scandinavia is maybe more of a natural unit. I mean, we see the world with Scandinavian eyes. I'm not sure it's a big difference from Swedish or Danish coverage necessarily. ZDF had a much better coverage of the border controls than Swedish and Danish television had, and so I think public service is doing well in the broad definition that I gave it. People are discussing, sharing information more than ever before in social media and so on. What we are discussing is there a market failure in the production of professional news, and how can that best be encouraged?
Okay.
And I think that is.
Thank you, Karen. Is that on the microphone? It doesn't seem like it. Okay. No, it's don't touch it.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is on.
I wanted to make a brief remark on the MasterChef thing, but about news consumption, I'm sorry, but research is actually pointing out that people still consume mostly national news. It's really a very small elite group that is interested in news from abroad. In fact, most people, over 70% of the population, is just interested in the television news, is not reading more than one newspaper title, and these are the countries where it's going well with news. So I think we need to nuance this idea of the active news consumption, regrettably so, a bit. About the MasterChef, I just wanted to ask you, because I do not necessarily have a problem with public broadcasters doing MasterChef if it makes sure they get attention for a nice documentary or a cultural program or whatever. I would have a problem with the fact that doing like 10 or 15 MasterChefs, so that the balance is missing. So I was wondering if you have the rigid position of no MasterChef, no The Voice, no whatever, or whether you actually meant that there should be a balance in terms of what they are bringing.
Thank you. Who would like to? Arto.
Okay, well, in our case, I would say we have discussed a lot about that, and in our case, the balance is so that when ILA is making or buying Finnish drama, that is very expensive comparing to what they can buy from other countries. So in our case, it is so that they are putting much more money to the Finnish-made programs than they are giving to the others. So I think it's okay. It's like more like so that they just get enough program to cover the whole both channels, that they are buying also programs outside.
Lasse?
I mean, this is pretty complicated, but in one way, I'm a firm believer in that public service should be the broad definition of public service. But I also think there are limits. I think public service stations should establish, and I've encouraged DR to do so far. They haven't listened to me. well, I live on, to say, make a point. Every time you discuss a program proposal, whether it's from your own people or from external production companies like my own, your first question was, you know the law about public service. You know this broad definition of public service in the law. You know what public service is about in general terms. How does this program contribute to that? And then if you see a number of programs, that was the reason when I was controller of programs at DR, I rejected the Robinson expedition, because I thought this is what I would call victimized television, and we would not have it on DR because of public service obligations. So that is always an interpretation. But I mean, if public service should only be the narrow discussion, it should only be Mozart or even Schönhausen or whatever, or it should only be philosophical discussions about literature, which it should also contain. Then I think what Professor Henrik Søndergaard, who is a lecturer at University of Copenhagen, said when he put out scenarios for the future of public service, he said, if the very narrow definition is forced on a public service station, or it forces it upon itself, it will be what he romantically described as suicide in fear of death.
We have to stop in 1 or 2 minutes. I'd just like one very last question to each of you. Let's say that for one day you would be minister in charge of media, and you have the chance to give out one proposal, just in one sentence. What would that be? One proposal, and then you're out of office again. Lasse?
Change the license fee to taxation like in Finland.
Thank you. Arto?
I would do it so that ILA must buy much more from the independent operators.
Nils?
I think it's difficult to argue that there is a market failure in Robinson, so I would encourage the production of news so that people would have, the citizens will have access to news so they can make their own opinions on public affairs.
Thank you. Bernt?
I would start take initiative for a process of privatization of the state broadcaster.
Having said that, we'll give a big applause to this panel. Thank you very much. And now we have some time for some conclusions, and I invite Agneta and Jan, please come up. A very short introduction. Who are you?
I'm a member of the Public Service Committee, I think we call it. And that's enough, I guess.
Okay, Janne.
I'm head of business area TV in Aftonbladet. Worked earlier at TV4 and have met many of the Nordic colleagues that has been on the stage. And I was 17 years in public broadcasting, SVT.
In spite of the fact that you're very accustomed with media, you're too close to the microphone. I'm sorry to say.
I love them.
Don't stay.
No, I stay here.
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
I try.
So you've heard a lot of remarks today, this morning. What are your thoughts, Agneta? Reflect.
Well, actually, I think the most interesting question raised this morning was the one you raised, Lasse, with what is exactly public service? How is the definition of public service? And I believe that in Sweden, we have let the public service companies, what we call the public service companies, they should actually be called the publicly financed media companies, because they have had kind of a monopoly situation regarding what they work with. And I think we very much should broaden the public service concept, because if you translate the public service to Swedish, it actually means allmänhetens tjänst. But if you read about the remits to the public service sector, it says that public service is in allmänhetens tjänst. So it's sort of a tårta på tårta, as we say in Swedish, which is, I think, we have to watch out with that. So I think the definition should not be made by those that we today call the public service companies, but the definition should be made by people or by the public or by anyone else, but not the companies themselves.
Janne?
I used to say every day when you learn new things and get new insights, that's a good day, and this is a good day. I think there has been a tremendously lot of interesting information, and I think I have too many remarks, but one more general conclusion, if we take the Swedish perspective, is that Sweden doesn't seem to be in the front line. It seems that we still are in the 1920s or something like that. And I think it's a huge problem that we still use this word public service that was actually invented 75 or 80 years ago. And it's connected to quite many specific things that are totally out of date.
What should we say?
Something else.
Okay.
Because it creates so many, people get stuck in opinions that I think is a block to a very creative discussion. But I have some concrete things, and that when I listen to what's happening in England, my many years in public service in Sweden, I remember how often and frequently we went to England to take the ideas and implement them in Sweden. But there's one thing that we don't copy, and that is the way the British, every 10 years or what it is, really go through the case. And I don't understand why. We have now a state control committee that shall do an overview to help media, to find new tools to attack the structural changes without scrutinizing what goes on in public service. And then we have this private initiative which obviously don't get contact with public service because they don't like to talk to them. So that's the Swedish model. I think it's totally crazy. It's anti-democratic. It's everything. How can a new government start this nice initiative without taking in one of the largest players on the media market? I don't understand it. Maybe that's the Swedish model. I don't know. But then it's a very crazy model. And second, the debate about MasterChef is actually, I think, one of the most important ones, because then you come to this very, very difficult question. What is public service today? Is it a specific company, or is it a specific kind of content? And if it is a specific kind of content, I think it's time, it's alert to define what kind of content is the content that is in the general public's interest and that will not be produced of others. It's not only Schopenhauer or Mozart or whatever. It's a lot of things. It's independent news in some way. It's coverage of foreign news. It's drama. It's features. It's a lot of things. But for good heaven's sake, start the discussion to define, even if it's very complicated.
But why is it, Agneta, if you look on Swedish debate, this commission is doing a great job in trying to get more of a discussion, but on a whole, it's very quiet about public service and private media. Why is that the case?
Well, I actually think that you could compare public service with Systembolaget, the Swedish retail monopoly on alcohol. We don't discuss Systembolaget. We think it's the Swedish model. It's the best. It's made by Sweden. It's made in Sweden. And the same goes for public service. Public service is the best. It's made by Swedes in Sweden, and we don't question it. We don't really want to debate about it. So I think the comparison with Systembolaget is a pretty good one, because actually Systembolaget, everybody says, okay, we have a monopoly, but still we have a big supply. It's greater than any other country. But if you've been to another country and have seen their special wine stores or special stores on alcohol, it's a tremendous supply and it's tremendous possibilities of choice and so on. So I do think that we could start trying to see public service that way too. There are alternatives. There are other ways of doing this if you consider that it's 9.2 billion crowns that public service gets every year.
Janne, are we perhaps brainwashed?
In some extent, maybe. I think we behave like a cripple because honestly speaking, we don't take in everything in the discussion because we pull a couple of things away. That is like a human being without legs, arms, and sometimes also an empty head. Sorry to say that, but you are pointing out this also very clear. In my memory, this is actually the first time that we have invited foreigners to discuss public service. That's quite interesting. I've never seen it before. But to be a little bit also criticizing what we are handling here, I would like to make totally another remark, because I think it's maybe not the best way to tackle the issue by always talking about the structural crisis in the private media sector. Because if that is the best argument to shrink or limit the public service sector, I think we will sooner or later be trapped in some severe problems, because the structural crisis is also very much linked to a brand new world that is international. And we heard some of the people here, I mean, when we talk about, is there any way to take taxes in a better way out from Facebook or Google? I mean, if we knock down this public service, which we would like to do, we will find that the problem is actually somewhere else. So I would like to see new discussions where it doesn't always start by the private media crisis, because that's not the best argument to change public service.
But if we look at the political landscape, we had non-socialist governments for 8 years. We now have a government dominated by the Social Democrats. And still, with these various governments, public service is no real issue. Agneta?
Well, actually, the government we had from 2010 to 2014, we did have a very big investigation on public service, and it actually landed in some quite clear suggestions. And one of them was to change the license fee system. But then at that time, I think the Minister of Finance, Anders Borg, he hesitated because he didn't want to raise the taxes in any way, although the tax raise would have been rather small, one could say. And he also wasn't sure of the majority in Parliament, or that is, he didn't have a majority. Yeah. So I think he was thinking, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So he just let it go. Yeah. And therefore, nothing happened really with public service during this period.
And Jan, when we spoke the other day before this, you said maybe even politicians are afraid of public service.
I mean, we are talking about quite huge, big, powerful media players. And of course, the political system in many extensions are depending on this public service company. Yeah. And they are also, in some extent, depending on good relations with the company.
So that shuts them up.
Don't just put this remark aside, because I think when we're talking about consensus from the left to the right, it is a fact. I mean, the only thing I can remember from my days in TV4, when we're talking about all those different committees and the huge changes that took place already with the digitalization, is a decision that there's a limitation, I think, up to 25 different items where SVT can do sponsorships. It's not a big issue. Sorry, I don't get wow, what a step, but not so much more than that, because the public value test doesn't work, because there's no demanding obligation to use it. It's up to you guys. And of course, if I have a law against me and the lawmaker says you can use it if you want, but if you don't want, don't use it. Well, what's the way forward?
Yeah. So one last question, and then I'm afraid we have to finish. But if there's one thing you would like this audience, when they go to bed tonight and they think, I was at that seminar, what do you want them to think? What should they remember on these issues? What's your most important argument, Agneta?
Well, actually, I think there are two things that I would like to mention. The first one is to change the license fee system, because we couldn't rely on TV sets anymore in order to watch what's happening. And the other one is that I think what we call public service should be broadened, so that journalism of high quality, anyone should be able to get something from that money if you can really prove or show that you have a journalistic high quality products. And I do think this would open up the what we today call public service, and I think it needs to be opened up because it's very close today in some ways.
Janne?
I would like to be a little more concrete on the first issue, because I don't understand really why we don't implement a pay TV system for public service, or a pay listening system for radio, because from a technical point of view that is very easy to implement. It also I think have a positive thing, and that is that drives you really to scrutinize, as someone said here earlier, try to discuss, is this really a public service program that people are willing to pay for because they don't have it anywhere else? And second thing is that it's also some sort of typical, more or less worldwide thing, that we always put the responsibility to someone else, and if something goes wrong, we definitely put it to you or to someone else. I think everyone now in this very intensive and changing media world has a responsibility to discuss public service, because it's a common interest. We can't say it's a political responsibility, a private media company responsibility. Everyone as a consumer of public service has the responsibility.
Thank you, both of you, very much. And I now give the floor to Gunnar again.
Well, just to round off, thank you to the speakers. It's been great that you took the time to come here to Stockholm and participate. We just learned that this has been an historic event. It's the first public service discussion with an international view in the history of Sweden. So that's fantastic. A great thank you. I have learned a lot today. It's been a lot of information per minute here this morning. And if you're afraid that you missed something, you can switch on tonight on the web and watch the whole thing again, if you want to. Or at least tell your friends to do it. A big thank you again. I have a small gift. Thank you for coming, everyone. And a small gift to the speakers. Some lunch. There is a lunch outside, a small one. So please feel free.